Would like to come forward and present?
Good morning, everyone. Today I get a chance to carry on some dialogue that I've been talking through with LASA over the last decade, and it was sort of triggered from early experiences working overseas in New Zealand in less regulated markets for the first time. And during the process since then, we've seen an interesting evolution in Australia looking towards less regulated markets. I think we got quite a big boost in 2013 with the Living Longer, Living Better legislation, and we've hit some hurdles since then, particularly with the 2016 budget. So we've got what I believe is a huge opportunity to take advantage of some of the changes that we must see from here. And today's presentation builds on some of the dialogue that we've already had this morning. I'm going to talk about what has been a challenging year. It's really important to talk, there's a little bit of doom and gloom at the beginning. I think it's really important to talk about this as a starting point to help us think about where we might go to improve the system that we have at the moment. I'd also really love to hear back from you. A lot of our experiences about what we see as being a challenging year comes not just from publications, but from talking to you guys about your experiences. So it'd be great to talk about that. As I said, I'd like to take that as being a starting point to leveraging us into what I believe is going to be inevitable change. And I think the inevitable change that we're moving towards is going to be really positive. I think the rate at which we get there and the format in which it takes has a lot to do with what we do over the next couple of years. So I want to talk about some of the impetus for that change and at the end perhaps challenge some of the elements of the Royal Commission and the election that we might be able to use to our advantage. And then I wanted to share with you my vision for what a future system might look like. And part of the reason that I like to talk about it is that a lot of our clients are working towards this, and some of the projects you've heard around today with Aveo, people investing big dollars in what they imagine that system to be in the future. And to an extent, we have to take a little bit of a leap of faith, particularly when we're committing tens of millions of dollars to new infrastructure. For some of our clients, hundreds of millions of dollars. And for us to be a bit proactive, identify the things that need to be worked on, envisage what it is that we would like for the future, will help us to work towards that moving forward. Great. So a challenging year. I'm not going to talk about Collingwood in this context. We made the grand final, we were robbed of the premiership in the last 8 minutes, but we're not talking about that as being part of the challenging year that we've had. We are facing, as we've talked about a lot this morning, around a growing older population base, but a changing one. When I look at a year in review of the work that we've been doing, it's a really good barometer of seeing how the industry is going. In tough years, where we've had financial constraints and changes in policy, we tend to find that we are very much focused on the operational level, so our nurses tend to be extremely busy, particularly at the moment with dealing with non-compliances. In good years, in positive years, we spend a lot more time on mergers and acquisitions and building new homes and retirement villages, and we've seen that slow down somewhat. The positives that we do get in terms of working more hands-on with providers around making sure that they maximise efficiency, looking at the additional services Bruce spoke about, but also managing compliances, we are getting much closer to the residents and their families. And a lot of the sentiment that's been echoed this morning around the changing expectations, we're not with the baby boomers yet, but they're certainly influencing the way that we carry out our business in their expectations for their parents and by the parents themselves. I mentioned before, 2016 we had some fairly heavy austerity measures. The budget cuts in 2016 have been really well publicised. Perhaps not as well publicised until the analysis of the budget took place in the current year, is that the government investment in a lot of other areas has come down as well, particularly in workforce assessment, and also in quality leading up until to the Oakton events. And so that change in emphasis and focus around funding in the industry has certainly had an impact for us. Bruce's comments from the Stuart Brown report as well, 45% of homes not cutting it. Obviously, flow-ons with investor confidence, we've seen, if you have a look at the quarterly reports we do on the ASX-listed operators, the share prices have come down substantially. Probably what's more important to us is that earlier comment that there has been a slowdown in new developments. The latest ACFA report estimates that we've got to invest over $50 billion over the next 10 years in new residential aged care homes. And sometimes it does get a bit frustrating. There is uncertainty at the moment, but a long-term investment on a home that we're expecting to last 25, 40 years shouldn't be so easily moved around by a change in short-term funding. The negative media, also we've talked about today, has had quite a critical impact and probably led into the Royal Commission into aged care. And as I said earlier, I think that Royal Commission into aged care presents us with an opportunity to get some of the key changes that we still need to make, quite aside from the roadmap, some of the key changes that we need to get out as quickly as possible. So while I do see the need to be defensive in some elements, there's an opportunity for us to be quite proactive here. And we're also getting prepared for the new aged care standards, and there's some terrific elements of the aged care standards in terms of moving forward towards a consumer perspective, but we're trying to get there at the same time managing a lot of non-compliance, and we are dealing with multiple sanctioned homes across our client base across Australia at the moment. So they have been some of the big challenges. I think some of the positives, and Bruce touched on them as well when he started to talk a little bit around diversification. One of the causes of the challenges that we've had comes from our very heavy dependence on government subsidies, particularly in home care and residential aged care. We have definitely seen an unprecedented change in our clients looking to diversify their services. We heard of AO today, the integrated services that they're building at the moment, Australian Unity, a number of other providers, most of our clients now looking for different areas and avenues to diversify. Certainly the ASX listed operators have been selling that as being one of the areas that they're looking at to help prevent themselves from being too exposed from changes in government policy. So that change and that integration, and 10 years ago, I talked about the experience that I had working in less regulated environments. And to me, into the future, essentially, it's all home care. It's just taking place in different built forms. And with that thought in mind, it's starting to change the way that our clients are looking to design and build their homes, but also how they're looking to deliver their services. Change is inevitable. I just want to talk about some of the reasons why I believe change is inevitable. And at the end, I'm going to paint that picture of where I think it's going to look like when we get this through. The speed at which we get it through, I think, will be influenced substantially by how we behave over the next 2 years to get our point across. The first that was already been mentioned today, Veronica spoke in the first presentation, and I'm going to come back to her presentation just about how heavily regulated we are. And we've talked about it until we're blue in the face. Extremely heavily regulated and price constrained. And that comes naturally with the territory. When the Commonwealth subsidised 94% of direct care costs, they have a responsibility to make sure that the funding is well used and restricted and capped to manageable levels. That then, as I mentioned before, exposes us to changes in funding. So 2016, when they changed the budget, we become then recipients of that change. I do notice that, and also changes in policy, I do notice that it can be a bit of an easy place to save money. We are quite often in denial about our own ageing, and so spending a lot of time on budget changes specifically around aged care up until recently has been much easier for government to do. And that's going to change from here. And all of that has made us exposed to being subsidy dependent. The other thing of change that is inevitable, Sean Rooney brought this out from a Bernard Salt graph. I love this graph because it shows the massive potential and the exciting opportunity that there is in this industry. You see where we are at the moment, the little orange one, 2/3 of the way across, and I love this on a variety of levels. But the first one is that huge, big proportion of people. Peter Costello in the Intergenerational Report focused on this. He said the baby boomers are 25% of our population. They control 55% of our wealth. And so it's not just that there are so many of them, it's also that everything to the left of where we are today tells us nothing about what's going to be required and where we're going to go into the future, which is what I believe makes this industry so exciting and so interesting going forward. You can see the blimp at the top there. That is 9 months after the soldiers returned from World War II. And you can see the huge growth that continued after that. The really interesting thing with Australia is, unlike most developed countries, we were already experiencing quite substantial population growth in the late 30s before World War II. And so that's significant because it's on us now, not so much in residential aged care, but moving into home care and retirement living. So you can see we're not waiting until that baby boomer generation. We have a pre-generation that we're starting to support now. So the move is happening, and it's moving very quickly. And the Productivity Commission talked about what that change meant. By the peak of the baby boomers, 2/3 of this country's wealth will be controlled by people that have retired. We have a halving of the number of people that are able to support those people. So the number of taxpayers will drop dramatically as part of that changing demographic. That's super critical, and I think the biggest trigger of everything that we will see from here is the need for us to review what David Tune said in his report, recommendations 13 and 15, which I think were the only elements of the report that have been actioned thus far, which deal with the fact that we can no longer provide services to people that are able to provide services themselves. And I think that is probably a bigger driver and more exciting than the roadmap or the reforms or whatever comes out of the Productivity Commission. Is this change is inevitable. There's too many people coming through the system for this shrinking taxpayer base to be able to support. And in my experience, nothing drives consumer-centric behaviour more than asking people to pay for stuff. Once you become responsible for that investment, you start to take much greater ownership of that investment. And this next generation of consumers are the architects of consumer choice. So choice around control, where they live, what they pay, what services they receive, will flow, in my view, very, very quickly. Veronica made another really important point today. And then David from ECH made a terrific point too. Sometimes they might choose for services that are outside our normal best practice. And so flexibility, not just in terms of how we deliver our services, but how we regulate the delivery of the services is really, really exciting. But Veronica made the point about moving from being more flexible to being more, too rigid to being more flexible and innovative. The other thing that she said was we need to look to hand control over to the consumer. And I think it's a good habit to be into because I think the next generation of consumers will take it. And I think that's a fundamental change, not only to the way that we deliver services, but the way that we build the infrastructure to support it. The other unlocking that is unacceptable that must change and will have to change, and a great platform for us to be able to look for opportunity, is access to home care packages. And I know this might be controversial. I'm going to show you some statistics in a minute. But I think the way that the government is capping supply on home care services is a much more expensive way of going about things because it puts a huge amount of pressure on our hospitals, on informal carers, on our families, and ultimately results in premature entry into residential aged care services. So we have a situation in Australia at the moment. There are more people assessed as being eligible to get home care support than we have actual packages being delivered. And that's a situation that will just continue to go into the future. If people are able to make a greater contribution towards the services that they receive, there will be more services available for everyone, will be better directed in the way that we provide that, and in my opinion, the way most people vote when they're invested in paying for the services themselves is the delivery of home care services rather than going into residential aged care. In Australia, we have a fairly high proportion of people ending up in long-term care, in residential aged care services. About 6.3% of people that are over 65. And I know if you have a look at some of the other countries that are included in this from the OECD data, there are significant cultural differences in places like Japan, some of the Mediterranean nations as well. But generally speaking, the proportion of people that are ending up in nursing homes is much greater here, and the length of stay that people are here, albeit shortening, is high compared to other developed countries. I think the trigger of means testing and moving towards providing a facilitating mechanism rather than just throwing more packages or extrapolating a system that's already not working, but to have a very clearly focused ageing at home program that helps to facilitate that means we'll be able to create more access to more people because the people who are able to pay for it will contribute. And it means that in residential aged care, our support for people at that point is going to be more directed, and we can focus more on the quality of their lives rather than just ensuring that we have clinical governance and safety. My vision for Australia as we move forward is one in which we have more equitable means testing. It is inevitable. The question is whether or not we make some courageous policy decisions to start moving us in that direction, or whether we just wait for a series of failures and imbalances to force us into this situation where we won't be well planned. I believe we have the opportunity to be able to make a positive contribution towards the former. With more equitable means testing, I think we'll see a rapid growth in home care supply. We need only just meet the people that are eligible to have a massive difference on the quality of life of the people who desperately need that support. We will be more well directed in our subsidies. We will be targeting people who are less able to pay for it. We'll be able to target residential aged care services and focus more on people's quality in life and strong clinical governance. We'll also be able to better support in the country. And that deregulation of supply thing, I do recognise that the Commonwealth is really keen to see more development in regional and remote areas, but I don't think ACAR categorising regional and remote as category 1 is going to encourage lots of people to go out and build in areas where it's very hard to make ends meet. And I think the outcome of all of this will lead us towards addressing consumers that, as we mentioned before and in the presentations today, consumers that will have really, really high expectations. And I think they'll have a lot of power, and I think they'll have member-based consumer groups that facilitate them to be able to make a lot of the decisions. And with our support, to the point that was made in the session before the break, we'll be less dependent on formally appointed commissioners and other elements to be able to tell us how we're doing. We'll be told how we're doing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Cam, for that presentation. Have we got any questions? Fantastic.
Yes, Sue Varden, I'm the chair of ACH in South Australia. I just want to say that was the most excellent presentation that I have heard in this whole conference, and I want to thank you for that. Your analysis of the market is exactly where we think it is. My question to you is, will you be making that presentation to the Royal Commission?
Thanks for that feedback. I hope we got that on camera. And if we did, we'll send it to the Royal Commission. I'm terrified of going into to the Royal Commission. I think it's going to be terrific talking through strategy with the peak bodies to see how these messages are being delivered. But yeah, I'd definitely be encouraged to make a presentation like that. And thank you for the feedback.
Are there any other points or questions? Fantastic.
Hi, Rachel Lane, Aged Care Gurus. I agree, that was a brilliant presentation, Cam. Just one question, how do you think we overcome this no man's land that we've got at the moment, where once a consumer's assets are exceeding the $166,000 cap, they fall into market price territory, and yet the resident can't normally afford the market price if they're, say, got $200,000 or $250,000 of assets? Do you have any ideas how we could overcome that anomaly in the current system?
Yeah, I think probably it needs a rework of the system from scratch, which I think what Tune was opening up to, that once you start to open the door on a proper means testing approach, it makes us rethink the way that we do that more generally. And I did mean to mention, and I'll just take thanks Rachel, I'll just take this opportunity quickly. I thought the three things that would be terrific for us to be moving towards, and we've already engaged with some of the church groups around their lobbying towards the election, is that I think a number of organisations are now thinking, because we've got a Royal Commission, and the opportunity to do some serious lobbying for this election is lost, and I don't believe that. I do understand that it gives you the ability to be able to duck and weave and sort of say, we've got a Royal Commission into that, we're going to look at that at the end of the Royal Commission. But there are some no-brainers, I think, that we can focus on. And I think the critical ones to be able to talk about is looking at that means test, if I've not harped on enough about that one. I think there is a need not to be bleating for more money, but we have been quite successful in the past while this thing is under focus, just at least to bring us a little bit closer to 2016 standards and get a little bit closer to the subsidies actually meeting the cost of delivering the care services. And the final thing, I think, is being able to lobbying for that age at home, age in place strategy. And I think readdressing the means testing is going to be critical to that first element. Thanks.
Cam, don't sit down, you're a popular man.
Cam, Jeff Taylor from Aegis Aged Care in Perth, and probably also for Bruce. So just wondering what's happening about RADs. There seems to be a decline in RADs and a move towards DAPs, and what impact is that having on building, if anything?
Yeah, look, Bruce said it really well. There actually had been a net increase in cash. Part of that was that proportionately the level of transition from RAD into DAP and RAD into combinations was offset by two things. One is that we've had fantastic property price increases on the East Coast, but the other thing is, and not always well recognised, but you can see it through the results of the listed providers, is that leading up to 2014, your standard high care resident wasn't eligible to receive, or most of your homes they were because you were extra services, but the majority of standard high care residents weren't attracting a RAD. And then as those residents passed, they were being replaced by residents that were for the first time as standard high care in the old language, bringing in lump sum deposits. And that was 2014, we're 2018, so average length of stay of 138 weeks or whatever it is. Most of those residents have left the system now, and so the number of RADs that came through in the last 2 quarters has decreased. Really critically, between 2016 and 2017, there was a 19% decrease in the number of people that opted for a pure RAD. Now, that has manifested. There are organisations that are specialising in helping people compete for a smaller number of lump sum paying residents. There are banks that are very interested in having conversations about how much better it is to get a combination or a DAP if we're getting a RAD equivalent that's twice the cost of us building the bed. And so I think the longer term issue is probably going to be okay, but it is slowing down some of our clients' development because they're concerned that the banks don't yet have their heads around what they're used to, which is we're going to build the thing, it's going to cost us 20 million, we're going to get $16 million in RADs, we're going to pay you back really quick, your exposure is then gone. And so that's been the main thing, I think, Jeff, is that a number of our clients are backing off, and we are spending time with Dave at the other banks to just talk about how we're going to be able to fund a system, because, to be perfectly honest, in the longer term, I don't think RADs are going to be nearly the feature that they are at the moment.
Just, is that on? Yeah. Just to